I always thought the worst part of my day was the migraine that sent me home early from work. I was wrong. The house was too quiet when I walked in. Mark's car in the driveway, Megan's shoes by the door, and on the hallway floor a pair of lace underwear that wasn't mine. My heart stopped before my feet did. I climbed the stairs like a ghost, each step heavier than the last. Steam curled from under the bathroom door, and then I heard them, my fiancé's low murmur, my sister's breathless whisper. She contributed cash, nothing on paper. Once refinancing closes, we push her out. Megan giggled. And then it's just us. I stood frozen hand hovering over the doorknob, $40,000 of my savings evaporating with every word. My engagement ring suddenly felt like a shackle around my finger. They thought I would crumble. They thought I would cry, scream, and run. Instead, I quietly walked downstairs, locked the front door, pulled out my phone, and made the first move that would destroy everything they had built together. Have you ever discovered that the people you loved most were secretly plotting your destruction? My name is Vanessa Coleman. I'm 35 years old, a senior financial analyst at one of Houston's most respected consulting firms. I've spent my entire adult life building something solid beneath my feet, a career-saving stability. And for the first time in my life, everything seemed to be falling into place. 3 months before what was supposed to be my wedding day, I genuinely believed I had finally found happiness. Mark and I had been living together for 8 months. The house was his, a charming 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, but it had started to feel like ours. I loved the creaky stairs, the big kitchen window overlooking the backyard, the way morning light filled the living room. I loved coming home to someone who said he loved me back. My parents never quite understood what I had accomplished. Growing up, I was the reliable one, the responsible one, the daughter who never caused problems. My younger sister Megan was the one who sparkled. She was 4 years younger, effortlessly charming, and somehow, every small thing she did earned praise that my biggest achievements never received. When I graduated top of my class, my mother spent the celebration dinner talking about Megan's new boyfriend. When I got promoted last year, my father forgot to call. I learned early that being good wasn't the same as being seen, but I made peace with it. I had my work, my independence, my quiet pride in what I had built. And then I had Mark. 8 months before the wedding, I made a decision that felt like trust. Mark wanted to renovate the house, new kitchen, updated bathrooms, a fresh start for our life together. The refinancing would cover most of it, but he needed $40,000 up front to begin. I had the savings. He promised to add my name to the deed once the refinancing closed. It's simpler this way, he said. Saves on legal fees. Once we're married, everything will be shared anyway. I believed him completely. I transferred the money the next week. Out of habit from my years in finance, I kept the receipts and saved his email confirmation. I never imagined I would need them. Then Megan arrived. She showed up 6 weeks ago with 2 suitcases and a tearful story. Her boyfriend had left her. She'd lost her job. She just needed somewhere to stay for a few weeks while she figured things out. Before I could even respond, Mark was already saying yes, already carrying her bags upstairs, already assuring her she could stay as long as she needed. I told myself it was kind. I told myself family helps family. But something shifted in our home after that. Mark and Megan started having conversations that stopped the moment I walked into a room. They exchanged glances I couldn't quite read. When I asked what they were whispering about, Megan smiled brightly. Wedding stuff. We're planning some surprises. Don't ruin it by asking too many questions. I wanted to believe her, so I did. Our neighbor Eleanor noticed things I refused to see. She was 68, widowed, and spent her afternoons reading on her porch. She had lived through her own betrayal decades ago, her husband leaving her for her own sister. She knew what the signs looked like. She saw Mark and Megan leaving together while I was at work. She saw the way his hand lingered on her back. She watched and waited, unsure how to tell me what she suspected. That evening, I came home to find Mark's phone on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a notification. I glanced down without thinking. The message preview was from a contact saved as M with a heart emoji. It read, "Can't wait until she's finally gone. Then it's just us." Mark walked in and grabbed the phone quickly. "Work stuff," he said, not meeting my eyes. I smiled and said nothing. But as I walked upstairs, my hands were trembling so hard I could barely grip the railing. 3 weeks passed, and I convinced myself I had imagined everything. The phone notification, the whispered conversations, the strange feeling that something was terribly wrong in my own home. Mark was attentive again, bringing me coffee in the morning, asking about my day. Megan was sweet, helping with dinner, talking about how excited she was for the wedding. I wanted so badly to believe that my suspicions were just stress, just pre-wedding nerves, just the anxiety of a woman who had never quite learned to trust happiness when it finally arrived. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. I left work early with a migraine so severe that the fluorescent lights felt like knives behind my eyes. My boss took one look at me and sent me home. I didn't text Mark. I didn't call ahead. I just wanted to crawl into bed and sleep until the pain stopped. When I pulled into the driveway, both cars were there. Mark's truck, Megan's little sedan. The house looked peaceful from outside. I let myself in quietly, not wanting to explain why I was home or invite conversation. All I wanted was silence and darkness. The downstairs was empty. I slipped off my shoes and started toward the stairs, already imagining my pillow, my blackout curtains, the relief of closing my eyes. Then I heard voices, muffled, coming from the upstairs bathroom. I froze with one foot on the bottom step. My first thought was innocent. Maybe Megan was asking Mark about a leaky faucet. Maybe they were discussing some household issue. But something in the tone made me hold my breath. I climbed the stairs, slowly, carefully, staying close to the wall where the wood didn't creak. The bathroom door was closed. Steam curled from the gap beneath it, and through the door I heard fragments of conversation that made my blood turn cold. Mark's voice first, low, confident. Before the refinancing closes, we need to make sure everything is in place. Then Megan. And my share. You promised me $30,000. That's what we agreed. Mark again. She contributed cash. Nothing on paper that ties her to the house legally. Once the refinancing goes through, there's no way she can prove anything. I stood in the hallway, unable to move, unable to breathe. My sister's voice soft and eager. My fiancé's voice calculating and cold. They were in the bathtub together discussing how to steal my money, my home, my future. I didn't have the complete picture. I didn't know every detail of their plan, but I had heard enough. My legs felt like they might give out beneath me. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself, then retreated down the stairs as silently as I had come. I made it to my car before the shaking started. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, hands trembling so violently I couldn't grip the steering wheel. I didn't cry. I was too shocked for tears. I just sat there replaying those fragments over and over, trying to find some other explanation, some innocent interpretation. There wasn't one. That night I lay in bed beside Mark and didn't sleep at all. The next few days I tried to tell someone, anyone. I called my mother and carefully explained what I had overheard. She cut me off before I finished. Vanessa, you've always been jealous of your sister, ever since you were children. Megan is just trying to help with your wedding, and you're looking for reasons to criticize her. My father was worse. He sighed heavily and said, maybe you should focus on being grateful that Mark is willing to put up with your attitude. When I tried to mention my concerns to Mark himself, testing whether he would react with guilt or defensiveness, he looked at me with practiced concern. Honey, I think you might need to talk to someone. This anxiety isn't healthy. Maybe a therapist could help you work through these feelings. He made me sound crazy. He made me doubt myself. And then Megan played her part perfectly. She called our parents in tears, sobbing about how Vanessa had accused her of terrible things, how she was just trying to help, how she didn't understand why her own sister would be so cruel. Within a week, the narrative had spread. Friends who used to call regularly stopped reaching out. When I texted them, responses were short, awkward, or didn't come at all. I later learned that Megan had been whispering to anyone who would listen about her concerns for my mental health. She painted herself as the worried sister, bravely enduring my paranoid accusations. The circle around me tightened. I was being systematically isolated, and I couldn't prove a single thing. Then Megan made a mistake. She borrowed my laptop one evening, claiming she needed to print a resume for a job application. I didn't think anything of it. She used it for an hour, thanked me, and went to bed. Later that night, I opened the laptop to check some work emails. Megan's email account was still logged in. The inbox was right there open on my screen. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew it might be considered a violation of privacy, but after everything I had heard, everything I suspected, I couldn't stop myself. I scrolled through her messages, and what I found made me sick. There were emails from collection agencies demanding payment on $30,000 of debt, credit cards maxed out, warnings about legal action. My sister wasn't just broke, she was drowning. And then I found the message chain with Mark. It dated back 6 months. 6 months. Before her supposed breakup. Before her supposed job loss. Before she ever showed up at our door with her suitcases and her tears. One message from Megan stood out, burned itself into my memory. She trusts you completely. That's what makes this work. I screenshot everything. Every email, every message, every piece of evidence I could find. Then I logged out of her account and closed the laptop. My hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. Something had shifted inside me. My sister hadn't stumbled into the situation. She had engineered it from the beginning. The following week, I took a personal day and consulted a lawyer. I brought everything. My bank transfer receipts showing the $40,000 I had contributed. Mark's email promising to add my name to the deed. The screenshots from Megan's inbox. The lawyer listened carefully, took notes, and then did something I hadn't expected. She searched court records for Mark's name. What she found confirmed my worst fears. 5 years ago, a woman named Rachel Torres had sued Mark for similar behavior. The case filing alleged promises about property financial contributions that vanished a pattern of deception. The case was eventually dismissed, but the details were documented. The lawyer couldn't find settlement information, likely sealed under a confidentiality agreement, but the court filing alone told me everything I needed to know. Mark had done this before. I wasn't his partner. I wasn't even his victim. I was his latest target. The lawyer looked at me across her desk. The screenshots are helpful, but they could claim you accessed her email without permission. We need them to confirm their plan in a way that's legally admissible. Text to you. Email something direct where Mark commits to his promises in writing. Can you get him to do that? I thought about the man sleeping in my bed. The man who kissed me goodbye every morning. The man who was planning to steal everything I had worked for. I thought about my sister who had pretended to need my help while plotting my destruction. I thought about my parents who had dismissed me without a second thought. And I thought about myself, the woman who had spent her whole life being overlooked, underestimated, invisible. I nodded slowly. I know exactly how to do that. The next 2 weeks, I became someone I barely recognized. On the surface, nothing changed. I smiled at Mark over breakfast. I made small talk with Megan. I went to work, came home, played the part of the trusting fiancé and the naive older sister. But underneath, I was building my case piece by piece, gathering everything I needed to tear their scheme apart. The first step was getting Mark to confirm his promises in writing. My lawyer had been clear. I needed direct communication, something that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or claimed to be taken out of context. So one evening, while Mark was watching television, I sent him a casual text from the kitchen. Hey, when is the refinancing supposed to close? I want to make sure I have all my documents ready for when you add my name to the deed like you promised. I watched him glance at his phone, type a quick response, and go back to his show without a second thought. His reply came through a moment later. Still a few weeks out. Don't worry about the deed stuff right now. Let's focus on the wedding first. I waited a few minutes, then followed up. But you did promise to add me after the renovation, right? I just want to make sure we're on the same page. He didn't even look up from the television this time. His response was quick, dismissive, exactly what I needed. Yes, I said I would. We'll figure it out after everything settles down. I screenshot both messages and sent them to my lawyer that night. She confirmed what I already knew. This was admissible evidence. Mark had just put his promise and his evasion in writing. He had no idea he had handed me exactly what I needed. The second piece came from an unexpected place. Eleanor Thompson had been watching from her porch for weeks, and I finally went to see her. I told myself I was just picking up some items I had stored in her garage months ago, but the truth was, I needed to know what she had seen. I barely had to ask. The moment I sat down on her porch, she looked at me with knowing eyes and said, I've been watching deer. I see them leave together when you're at work. I see how he touches her when they think no one is looking, the way they stand too close, the way they look at each other. She paused, and something painful crossed her face. 20 years ago, my husband left me for my own sister. I lost everything. My home, my savings, my dignity. No one believed me because I had no proof. I was the hysterical woman making accusations, and she was the sweet younger sister who would never do such a thing. She reached over and took my hand. I can't give you video of anything definitive, but I can testify to what I've observed, the patterns, the behavior. If you ever need someone to stand up and tell the truth about what's happening in that house, I'll do it. I'll swear to it in court if I have to. I left her house with something more valuable than any recording. I had a credible witness with no stake in the outcome, a woman whose only motivation was making sure another woman didn't suffer the way she had. My parents called a family meeting the following Saturday. They said they wanted to resolve the conflict and clear the air before the wedding. I knew exactly what that meant. Megan had been working on them painting herself as the victim of my jealousy, and they wanted to sit me down and lecture me about being kinder to my sister. When I arrived at their house, Mark and Megan were already there, sitting together on the couch, wearing matching expressions of concern. Megan's eyes were red as if she had been crying. Mark kept his hand on her shoulder, the supportive, almost brother-in-law, comforting his troubled future sister-in-law. It was a perfect performance. My mother started immediately. Vanessa, we're very worried about you. Megan has told us about these accusations you've been making, and frankly, we think you need help. My father nodded. You've always had a hard time accepting that your sister might be happy. We thought you had grown out of this jealousy, but clearly we were wrong. Megan dabbed at her eyes. I just want us to be a family. I don't understand why she hates me so much. I let them finish. I let them say everything they wanted to say, and then I spoke. Before we continue, I have some things to share. I opened my folder and began laying documents on the coffee table. First, the text messages from Mark printed and dated. These are texts from Mark confirming he promised to add my name to the deed after I contributed money to the renovation. He also admits he's delaying. Next, my bank transfer receipts. This is proof that I transferred $40,000 to Mark 8 months ago for the house renovation. Then the court filing. This is a lawsuit from 5 years ago. A woman named Rachel Torres accused Mark of the same thing, promises about property financial contributions that disappeared. The case was dismissed, but the pattern is documented. Megan's emails came next. These are messages between Megan and Mark dating back 6 months, before her breakup, before her job loss, before she ever showed up at our door needing help. And finally, the collection notices. These are emails from collection agencies demanding $30,000 from Megan. This is why she needed this scheme to work. The room went completely silent. My mother's face had gone pale. My father stared at the documents like he couldn't understand what he was seeing. Mark's jaw tightened. Megan's performance crumbled. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Mark tried to recover. These are taken out of context. Vanessa is twisting everything to fit her narrative. But his voice lacked conviction. The documents were right there, undeniable, damning. Megan panicked. Her survival instinct kicked in, and she turned on her partner without hesitation. He approached me, she said, her voice rising. He knew I was in debt. He said he could help me if I helped him. This was his idea. Mark's head snapped toward her fury, replacing his careful composure. Are you serious right now? You researched me. You found out about my house and the refinancing, and you came after me. You showed up at that bar 6 months ago because you had already planned this. My father's voice cut through their argument. How long has this been going on? Megan, still crying, tried to minimize. Just a few weeks. It's not what it looks like. But Mark, furious at being made the scapegoat, corrected her immediately. 6 months. She's been planning this for 6 months. She picked me because she knew I had assets and her sister had savings. They weren't confessing. They were trying to survive by destroying each other. And in doing so, they confirmed every single thing I had suspected. I gathered my documents and stood up. The room was chaos. My mother was crying. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Megan and Mark were still arguing, accusations flying back and forth, each one revealing more than they intended. I waited until there was a brief silence, and then I spoke clearly and calmly. Mark, you have 30 days to sign a promissory note for my $40,000 plus interest. If you don't, my lawyer will file a civil fraud case. And I'll make sure the bank investigating your refinancing knows all about Rachel Torres and what happened 5 years ago. I turned to Megan. And you might want to check if being involved in a mortgage fraud scheme affects your credit situation. I imagine your collection agencies would be very interested to know what you've been doing." I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard my mother calling my name, heard Megan sobbing, heard Mark shouting that this wasn't over. I didn't turn around. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, got in my car, and drove away. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The months that followed were nothing like what I had imagined my life would look like at 35. 3 months before I had been planning a wedding, decorating a house I thought would be my home, trusting two people who had been planning my destruction. Now I was watching everything they had built together collapse piece by piece while I slowly put my own life back together. Mark's downfall came not from anything I did directly, but from his own greed catching up with him. The bank investigating his refinancing application discovered something I hadn't even known about. Mark had falsified his income documents. The salary he claimed on the mortgage paperwork didn't match his actual W-2 records. He had inflated his income by almost 30% to qualify for a larger loan. This was mortgage fraud completely separate from what he had tried to do to me. His employer, a financial services firm that handled other people's investments, learned about the investigation within weeks. They suspended him immediately pending internal review. In his industry, falsifying financial documents wasn't just a fireable offense. It was career-ending. No one in finance would ever trust him again. And then Rachel Torres reappeared. She had been his victim 5 years earlier, the woman whose lawsuit had been dismissed, whose settlement had been sealed. When her old lawyer heard about the investigation, he contacted her. She had been waiting 5 years for someone to believe her, for someone else to come forward, for Mark to finally face consequences. She provided a detailed statement to the authorities documenting everything he had done to her. Mark's past had finally caught up with him. The carefully constructed life he had built on other people's money was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Megan's reckoning was quieter, but equally devastating. After the family meeting, she had nowhere to go. Our parents didn't throw her out dramatically. There was no screaming, no door slamming, no final confrontation. Instead, there was something worse. A quiet, disappointed conversation where our mother said, "We think you need to figure some things out on your own. We can't have you here right now." For a woman who had spent her entire life being the favorite, being the one who could do no wrong, those words were devastating. She tried to stay with Mark, but he refused. He blamed her for everything that had happened at the meeting. "You made everything worse," he told her. "You panicked and dragged me down with you." The two people who had conspired together couldn't even stand to be in the same room anymore. Megan's creditors sensed her instability. Collection agencies that had been sending polite notices suddenly became aggressive. They called constantly. They threatened legal action. The $30,000 she owed had been manageable when she thought she was about to get a share of my money. Now it was a weight around her neck dragging her under. She called me repeatedly in those weeks. I never answered. She left voicemails that cycled through every emotion. First came anger. "This is your fault. You destroyed our family. I hope you're happy." Then came blame. "Mark manipulated me. I was vulnerable and he took advantage. You should be angry at him, not me." Then came desperate apology. "Please, Vanessa, I'm your sister. I made a mistake. Everyone makes mistakes. Please just talk to me." I listened to every voicemail. I saved them all. And I never called her back. For the first time in her 31 years, Megan was facing consequences she could not charm her way out of, could not cry her way out of, could not manipulate someone else into fixing. She was finally completely alone. The alliance between them didn't shatter all at once. It deteriorated over weeks, each stage more bitter than the last. The first week after the family meeting, they tried to maintain a united front. They agreed on a story coordinated. Their version of events presented themselves as victims of my vindictiveness. But the cracks appeared almost immediately. By the second week, Mark started distancing himself. He told mutual friends that Megan had exaggerated their relationship, that she had pursued him, that he had been confused and made a mistake. He was rewriting history to make himself look like the victim of her scheming. Megan found out, of course. By the third week, she was telling her own version to anyone who would listen. Mark had targeted her vulnerability. He knew she was in debt. He knew she was desperate. He had used her, and now he was throwing her away. Each of them was trying to sacrifice the other to save themselves. By the fourth week, they were actively providing damaging information about each other. Mark told people about Megan's debt, her shopping addiction, her history of manipulation. Megan told people about Mark's previous victim, his pattern of fraud, his calculated deception. They had built their relationship on lies and betrayal, and when the pressure came, they turned those same weapons on each other. There was no loyalty between them. There never had been. They had been partners in crime, not partners in love, and criminals always turn on each other when they're cornered. While they destroyed each other, I quietly rebuilt my life. Mark signed the promissory note within the 30-day deadline. He couldn't afford a lawsuit on top of the bank investigation and the potential criminal charges. My lawyer negotiated the terms. He would repay my $40,000 plus interest over 18 months starting immediately. He would have to liquidate assets to make the payments. The house he had schemed so hard to keep would probably have to be sold. I didn't feel satisfaction watching him lose everything. I just felt tired and ready to move on. I found a small one-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city. It wasn't fancy. The kitchen was tiny, the closet was cramped, and the view was just a parking lot. But it was mine. Every inch of it was mine. No one else's name was on the lease. No one else had a key. I painted the walls a soft gray, bought a comfortable couch, set up my bedroom exactly the way I wanted. For the first time in my life, I had a space that belonged entirely to me. At work, my boss called me into her office a few weeks after I moved. She had heard about what happened. Office gossip travels fast. She looked at me with concern and said, "I know you've been through a difficult time. The director position is still yours if you want it, but we can postpone if you need more time to recover." I shook my head. I've worked for this promotion for years. I earned it before any of this happened. I'm ready. She smiled and shook my hand. The announcement went out the following Monday. I was officially a director. Eleanor came to visit my new apartment one afternoon carrying a small plant in a ceramic pot. She looked around at my modest space with approval in her eyes. "This is lovely, dear," she said. "A fresh start." She set the plant on my windowsill where it would get the morning light. "For your new beginning. Something that will grow with you." I hugged her, this woman, who had believed me when no one else would, who had offered to testify because she remembered her own pain. She had become more than a neighbor. She had become a friend. That evening, I was unpacking the last of my books when my phone rang. It was my lawyer. "I have someone who wants to speak with you," she said. "Her name is Rachel Torres. She was Mark's victim 5 years ago. She learned about your case through the investigation, and she reached out to me." There was a pause. "She's been waiting a long time for someone to finally stop him. She'd like to meet you if you're willing." I stood in my quiet apartment surrounded by boxes and new furniture and the plant Eleanor had given me. 5 years ago, Rachel Torres had tried to warn someone. No one had listened. Now she finally had proof that she wasn't crazy, wasn't lying, wasn't the vindictive ex-girlfriend Mark had painted her as. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to meet her too." I met Rachel Torres at a quiet cafe on a Tuesday afternoon 5 months after my world had fallen apart and been rebuilt into something stronger. She was already seated when I arrived, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a calm presence that spoke of hard-won peace. We recognized each other immediately, two strangers connected by the same man who had tried to destroy us both. She stood and hugged me, like we were old friends, and in a way we were. We had survived the same predator. Rachel told me her story over coffee. 5 years ago, she had been where I was, engaged to Mark, trusting him completely, contributing money to what she thought was their shared future. When she discovered the truth, she tried to fight back, but Mark was smoother, then more careful. The lawsuit was dismissed on technicalities. She settled for $50,000 paid out over years, bound by a confidentiality agreement that kept her silent. I tried to warn the woman after me. She said, her voice heavy with old guilt. "I found out he was dating someone new, and I reached out to her. She didn't believe me. She thought I was a jealous ex trying to cause trouble. I felt so helpless watching him move on to the next victim, knowing I couldn't stop him." She paused and looked at me with something like gratitude. "But you stopped him. You got the evidence. You made people listen." She explained that the $50,000 settlement was why Mark had been so desperate for the refinancing scheme. He had been paying her back for years, draining his resources, needing new money to replace what he owed. I had been his solution. My $40,000 was supposed to dig him out of the hole Rachel had put him in. Together, our documentation and testimony had given investigators everything they needed. Criminal charges were likely. Mark would finally face real consequences. Rachel had carried guilt for 5 years, wondering if she could have done more. Now she finally had closure, and I realized that I hadn't just saved myself. I had stopped a predator from finding another victim after me. 2 weeks later, Mark requested a meeting through his lawyer. He claimed he wanted closure, a chance to explain a final conversation before we both moved on with our lives. My first instinct was to refuse. I had nothing to say to him and nothing I needed to hear, but something made me agree. Perhaps I needed to see him one last time diminished and defeated to fully close this chapter. I set the terms. A public cafe in broad daylight. I arrived first and chose a seat near the window where everyone could see us. When Mark walked in, I barely recognized him. He had lost weight. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, his confidence completely gone. He sat across from me and immediately started talking. He apologized, though the apology felt rehearsed and hollow. He blamed Megan, saying she had manipulated him, that he had been weak and foolish. He blamed his debts, the pressure he was under, the mistakes of his past catching up with him. And then, most pathetically, he claimed he had really loved me at first. It wasn't all fake, Vanessa. In the beginning, I genuinely cared about you. Things just got complicated. I listened without reaction. I let him exhaust every excuse, every justification, every attempt to rewrite history into something more flattering. When he finally stopped talking, I looked at him and said the only thing that mattered. You taught me something valuable, Mark. You taught me that I was waiting for someone else to validate my worth. I spent my whole life hoping my parents would see me, hoping a partner would choose me, hoping someone would finally recognize what I had to offer. You showed me what happens when you give that power to the wrong person. I reached into my purse and pulled out the engagement ring I had kept in a drawer for months. I set it on the table between us. I won't make that mistake again. I stood up, left the ring where it lay, and walked out of the cafe. I didn't look back. There were no tears, no dramatic final words, no lingering emotions. I was simply done. My parents came to visit my apartment a few weeks later. They brought food as if a casserole could make up for years of blindness. They stood awkwardly in my small living room, looking at the space I had created for myself, and tried to find the right words. My mother spoke first, her voice halting and uncertain. We should have listened to you. We didn't see what was happening. We were so used to thinking of Megan as the one who needed protecting, that we forgot you needed us too. My father nodded, but couldn't quite meet my eyes. We made mistakes. A lot of them. Going back further than just this. It wasn't a perfect apology. They still struggled to fully acknowledge the years of favoritism, the ways they had made me invisible in my own family. But it was something. It was more than I had ever gotten before. I accepted what they could give. I love you both, I said, and I want you in my life. But things will be different now. I won't sacrifice myself to keep peace in this family anymore. I won't pretend everything is fine when it isn't. And I won't be the one who always has to understand and forgive and move on. They nodded, not fully understanding, but accepting. We hugged and they left, and I knew our relationship would never be what it was. It would be something new, built on honesty, instead of my silence. As for Megan, she continued leaving voicemails for months. Angry messages, tearful messages, desperate pleas for forgiveness. I listened to all of them. I never responded to any. I had learned something important through all of this. Forgiveness doesn't require reopening doors to people who proved they would hurt you. I could release my anger, wish her well in my heart, and still choose to keep her out of my life. That wasn't cruelty. That was wisdom. 8 months after everything began, I stood at my apartment window on a quiet Sunday morning coffee, warming my hands, watching the sun rise over the city. My first bonus as director had arrived the week before, and I had donated a portion of it to an organization that helps women experiencing financial abuse in relationships. I understood now how easily it happens, how invisible it can be, how smart and capable women can find themselves trapped by people they trusted. Eleanor had become a genuine friend, visiting for tea every week, 2 generations of women bonded by surviving similar betrayals. She had started a small garden on her porch and was teaching me which plants thrived in the Texas heat. Each evening I wrote in a journal, not to forget the pain, but to remember how far I had traveled, to document the woman I was becoming instead of the woman I had been. Standing at that window, I realized something had fundamentally shifted inside me. I wasn't waiting to be chosen anymore. I wasn't seeking validation from my parents, from a partner, from anyone. For the first time in 35 years, my life belonged entirely to me. The apartment was small, but it was mine. The career was demanding, but I had earned it. The future was uncertain, but I was no longer afraid of it. I used to believe that happiness meant being chosen by someone else. Now I understand the truth. Real happiness begins the moment you finally choose yourself. Vanessa's story reminds us of something we often forget in our daily lives. The people closest to us are not always the ones who have our best interests at heart. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we trust the most, and the hardest boundaries to set are the ones with family. But here is the truth that Vanessa learned, and that I hope you carry with you today. Your worth is not determined by whether others choose to see it. You do not need validation from parents who overlooked you, from partners who deceived you, or from siblings who betrayed you. Your value exists whether anyone acknowledges it or not. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply choose yourself. If you are in a situation where someone is asking you to contribute money to shared assets, protect yourself. Keep records. Get promises in writing. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. These are not signs of distrust. They are signs of wisdom. And if you have already been hurt, know this. It is never too late to rebuild. It is never too late to set boundaries. It is never too late to create a life that belongs entirely to you. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart or reminded you of your own journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was not who they seemed? Your story matters, and this community is here to listen. Until next time, remember to choose yourself first.